Welcome to Gringo. Today we have a special episode 100% in English where I'll be reacting to a video that's been creating a lot of buzz in the Polyglot circles with over 150,000 views and over 1,000 comments in just a week's time. Now this video was made by big-time Polyglot and YouTuber Olly Richards, and the title of this video is How Mormon Missionaries Learn Languages Fast. And if you didn't know this about me, I learned Spanish by serving a Mormon or LDS mission in Guatemala, and so obviously I had to dress the part today. But all kidding aside, I just couldn't resist the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this topic. To be honest, I reached out to Olly to see if he'd be interested in some of my feedback, but obviously someone with over 80,000 subscribers can't, respond to everyone. And so instead I decided to create this video, adding a few things, clarifying a few things, but to be honest, this video is really well done by Olly. You can tell he did a lot of good research, and he's very respectful in the way he portrays it and focuses, on the language learning aspect and dissecting the benefits of this method for learning languages. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're obviously going to keep this strictly focused on language learning. So we'll be watching this video together, and I'll be popping in and out, adding a few comments here and there. And then at the end, I'll just have some closing remarks and add a few things that I think might need to be mentioned. So I hope you enjoy the video.
What if I told you that you had to learn to speak Korean from scratch and you had 9 weeks to do it? What happens after 9 weeks? Well, you will be put on a plane to Korea. And in Korea, you will have to stand on a street corner talking to complete strangers in Korean with no English allowed for 2 whole years. That's not going to happen, is it? Wait, what? 36,000 people a year do this. Can we look into this? That's right, in this video we are going to be looking at what is surely one of the most wildly effective language training programs in the world.
Minä tiedän, että tämä kirkko on totta ja olen hyvin kiitollinen siitä, että minä sain palvella lähetyssaarnaajana.
盼大望望有一鋪出聲慶，而家我要做一位傳教士，為耶穌基督考企先禱教會嘅。
Nasayad ko na tinurang basahon ni Mormon.
And in case you're not familiar with these young men and women, they are Mormon missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A mission is an expedition undertaken by 18 to 26-year-olds to spread the Mormon faith to new people with the aim of expanding the church. Now, this is important background for the rest of the video, but I do try to avoid talking politics and religion in polite company. And so everything that follows here is a commentary on the language learning, not the religion. So any comments, please leave them in that spirit.
And yeah, I really appreciate that Olly says this at the beginning, and so I'd just like to reiterate this point to keep everything respectful, because this really is just about the language learning method.
Now, all of this linguistic wizardry takes place right here. It is the Mormon Missionary Training Center, or MTC, in Utah in the USA. It's essentially a boot camp to train young Mormons in foreign languages before they set out on their missions, but it is widely regarded as one of the best language instruction institutes in the world. In fact, the courses resemble the programs that the US military put their linguists through at the Defense Language Institute, with one small difference. The military, they let you kind of slack off comparatively with 64 weeks to learn your language rather than 9. Oh, and those 9 weeks that Mormon missionaries get to learn Korean, well, that's only because Korean has its own script, its own alphabet. If you were learning, say, Portuguese, well, then you've got 6 weeks. Yep, you heard me right, 6 weeks to learn a language.
Yeah, so this was my case with Spanish. We only had 6 weeks to learn.
They're going to put me out of a job over here. One thing's for sure, the program and method is designed to push you. These young missionaries don't just get trained in foreign languages, they get trained extremely fast, and then they get put straight on a plane and thrown right in at the deep end. So the question you've been dying to ask is, well, how on earth do they do it? Well, I looked up some ex-missionaries to find the answers.
Yeah, so you get a letter in the mail and they tell you where you're going, and yeah, I got sent to Korea, so I was pretty unsure of what to expect. You just apply to be a missionary, and then they send you anywhere, and they could send you somewhere in your own country or in another country, somewhere where you have to learn a language, somewhere where you don't, and you don't have any say in that. So I didn't really count on having a language learning experience as a missionary, but it happened that way.
So this is the first thing that makes the Mormon method unique. You don't get to choose which language you will learn. You're 18 years old, you decide to be a missionary, you fill out your application form, you apply, and then the letter comes in the post telling you where you've been assigned to. Of course, you might get lucky.
You are hereby called to serve as a missionary of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You are assigned to labor in the Denmark, Copenhagen.
So you arrive at the Mormon Training Center and go straight into an intensive language learning program, where your task is to learn the language well enough to be able to talk to strangers in another country and persuade them to believe in the Mormon doctrine. And there are a lot of languages taught there, 56 languages altogether. 31 of these take 9 weeks of training. That's the Asian languages, Slavic languages, and then the 6-week courses are Germanic languages, Romance languages, and so on. These are languages considered to be slightly easier for native speakers. Now, interestingly, there are also 14 international missionary training centers around the world, and you can see some of them here.
So I actually went to the MTC in Guatemala, so I have a slightly different perspective on this, though I do have friends, obviously, that went to the Provo MTC, and friends even that went to Sao Paulo MTC. So there are at least 3 key differences by going to an MTC outside of Provo. For example, in my case, going to Guatemala, all of my instructors were native Guatemalans. About half of them spoke English fairly well, but really that was the key difference, is that we weren't being taught by native English speakers in a foreign language. The second big difference is that some of our roommates were natives, maybe not from Guatemala, but other neighboring countries. And so when we went to our room, we had further opportunities to interact with native speakers, and it was a much more casual conversation in the sense that we weren't, in a classroom studying principles. And the third key difference is that you have the opportunity to actually go out into the city. So I went out into Guatemala City twice during my time in the MTC to actually see what the city is like, and to actually hear natives trying to speak with me. And that was kind of like a wake-up call to see that where you were in the language learning process. So I think those are a few advantages or just differences about going to an MTC outside of Provo.
Into the program, knowing this will be really your only chance to learn the language you need for your mission, because once you get on a plane, well, that's it. There's no more instruction.
The alphabet they did, I still remember we went in day 1, and they just started speaking in Korean to us right away. There was no English at all, and I didn't even know how to say hello or nice to meet you or anything. So I was just so stressed out, I remember. And they taught us the alphabet the first day. So that's really handy with Korean, is the alphabet's pretty easy to wrap your head around. So we did that in a day, and then from then on, we weren't allowed to use English letters anymore either in our studying. So it was pretty quick.
That's pretty amazing. And talk about being chucked in at the deep end. There's no English allowed at all, which I suppose is kind of standard for an immersion program.
So to be honest, my experience in the MTC was not this strict. We were allowed to communicate in English on occasion when you just maybe needed a break, or it was just challenging to communicate in your target language. And certainly outside of the classroom setting with other English native speakers, I spoke primarily in English. So let's not exaggerate how strict it was for an immersion program. But yes, the whole point was to primarily be speaking in the target language, especially with your instructors.
But remember that their actual missionary training, the religious aspect, is also done almost entirely in the target language from day 1. So it's not just learning about the language and the grammar and stuff, it's content as well. By the way, the guy you just heard from is Derek Driggs, who actually taught me a bit of Korean when we did the recording for Michelle Thomas Korean. And he may or may not be the subject of a detailed method breakdown video in the near future. So make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you want to hear about that. I'm putting myself in that position, knowing that I'm gonna get only 6 weeks of training before being sent abroad. I mean, if it were me, I'd probably try to do my own crash course before going. A bit like this guy who got the news 3 months early that he was being sent to Estonia.
I tried as much to study the language before I went into the MTC. There's not really, I don't want to tell people not to do that, but I found it almost not worth the effort that I put into it before I got to the MTC.
Not worth it? Why not?
I mean, I had 3 months, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be good. And I literally outlearned what I had learned in 3 months in 2 days in the MTC.
So yeah, this is very common. I also tried to do like a couple months of Spanish. I mean, my parents are fluent in Spanish from having served missions in Colombia and the Dominican Republic, and my sister is fluent in Spanish, and so at the time I was, try to study with them, but really it's so true that what you can do in those 2-3 months, because you're probably using more traditional methods, it doesn't help you at all for preparing for what you really need to learn, and that's what you learn in the MTC.
I think that regular viewers of this channel will most likely hear that and think, well, hang on a minute, there's a hell of a lot you could do to prepare in those 3 months, even for an under-resourced language like Estonian. And I agree with you, especially if you use a method like story learning where you're immersing and priming your brain to understand the language. And so what I think this goes to show is just how fresh these guys are. These are not people with a few languages under their belt, familiar with language learning methods. These are people who are totally new to language learning. So can you imagine the impact on someone like this, going into a full immersion program with no preparation or experience? It's quite something. So what is a typical study day like at the MTC? Well, they wake up at 6:30 in the morning and get some exercise time and some Bible study time. And then the day really gets going with a Mormon hymn, sung, of course, entirely in the target language.
来向他学习。
So singing the hymns was a huge part of learning a language, because when you sing a hymn, you sing much more slowly. You pronounce every syllable. You get some very clear vocab that's going to be useful for teaching gospel principles. And so, yeah, hymns were essential. We studied hymns, we sang hymns all the time.
By 10 a.m, they are in classes where they're placed in small groups between 8 to 12 students. The day is basically broken down into 3-hour learning slots, making up 2 or 3 classes a day. Different instructors come in throughout the day teaching various language points. And like I said, almost everything is taught in the target language. I mean, can you imagine being taught how to do a new job in a language that you've just started learning? It's pretty full on. Now, something that I really like about this method is that the instructors are all former missionaries themselves who went through the exact same learning process. And I'm quite critical sometimes of language teachers who have never learned another language themselves. I do consider that to be kind of essential. So I really like the fact that they bring existing teachers back to teaching that training center, because these guys must have a lot of empathy for their students and what they're about to go through. And I'm not just talking about the languages here. More on that later, so stick around.
And so to call back on my previous point, for people outside of Provo and the other MTCs, they're primarily having native speakers that did not learn their target language, obviously, and so this point isn't universally true.
Speaking begins immediately, even though no one really knows what they're doing.
如果我主我的心，
我爱我的同伴。
Comment est-ce que ça change la façon dont nous enseignons?
So the teacher gets going right away with simple repeated phrases that are also written on the board. There are clear spoken models, and the teacher will speed their voice up, slow it down, exaggerate the tones, and there's absolutely no English spoken. And as soon as a student has learned something new, they're expected to only say it in the target language from that moment on. Sometimes English is essential for explaining stuff, but then it's only written on the board with translation. The English is never spoken aloud.
Yeah, this aspect of only English on the board is a really foreign concept to me. That was definitely not a rule either in my time or because I was in the Guatemala MTC, or it's just a personal preference that certain teachers had their different ways. It's not so uniform that every classroom looks identical.
And then they are told that in 2 days' time, they themselves will be teaching a full lesson in the new language. I mean, at least they'll be practicing on other missionaries or volunteers, but again, more on that later. But wait a minute, if everything is said only in the target language, how on earth do they understand anything? Well, a major focus of each 3-hour class is introducing a new grammar principle, and there's a lot of repetition of the grammar forms that are learned in class. So for example, if it's a subject, verb, object language, then the class will recite phrases using that subject, verb, object form over and over. So the first thing they learn quickly is what a proper sentence in the language sounds like. The idea here is that they train themselves to recognize a subject or a verb or an object before even understanding what was said, which then makes it easier to spot something like a conjugation or some other part of speech later on. Then, in the speaking practice sessions, they'll use shorter sentences in very carefully controlled practice, so that the focus is on developing accuracy on specific things, learning to say specific things very well, rather than, say, general fluency on a wide range of topics.
And so while the first 3 lessons are a lot of theology and religious terminology, the 4th lesson is actually much more practical terminology. It's things that the person will have to do in their everyday life. And so that 4th lesson is actually the most challenging for missionaries, because the first 3 lessons, they've gotten really good at talking about theology, but then when they have to talk about more practical applications of the doctrinal principles, that can usually throw them for a loop. It's a little bit more challenging.
It is an interesting ethos, given that they're going to be parachuted into a new country very shortly and have to survive there, presumably in a range of very different situations. But when you consider how specific the goals are for these missionaries and the very specific things that they will need to talk about with the people that they meet, you can see exactly why these very specific direct drills are so important. My interpretation here, and I hope I've got this right, and please feel free to correct me in the comments if I get this wrong for some reason, it's basically this. The missionaries have one job, which is to talk to people about their religion. They don't need to do anything else. They just need to be able to talk about that one thing very, very well. So you'd better train that one thing as hard as you can. If you think about it, linguistically, this is quite an unusual requirement. I mean, where else would you be so focused on one topic area? It's worth thinking about this as you ponder the method that we are discussing here. It's a method for a very specific purpose, which is quite likely not your reason for learning a language.
The missionaries may not be fluent by the time they leave, but in just a few weeks, many will establish a solid base to build from. What's the secret?
They are constantly speaking Tagalog at all times, and on top of that is they have grammar practice with me, but they are encouraged to be speaking Tagalog as much as they would in the Philippines.
Now, as for vocabulary, there's a gradual build from simple words to more difficult words. Once everyone has the pronunciation down, then individual students are quizzed and drilled. So it's quite intense and really quite traditional as well.
So herein lies my main critique of this method. So what Olly just said is, once you have pronunciation down, and I'm sorry, but you cannot have pronunciation down at that stage of the game. And what I really think, although the method is very effective at getting you conversant and able to communicate with people, you learn a lot of bad habits so early on that are hard to unlearn. And it's primarily because you haven't trained your ear to that language yet. You have not heard enough dialogue. You have not heard enough native speakers. You need a lot more input. And so while you're able to create this output to communicate, you actually don't have a really refined ability to make the right sounds. And years down the road, that's going to come back to haunt you. I've felt that with Spanish, that it's taking a lot of work for me to overcome some pronunciation issues that were ingrained in me. And I remember at points during the mission having native speakers tell me, you know, this one sound you're really not making properly. And I had never noticed it, primarily because I was just, supposed to start speaking from day one and never really had a chance to pick up on how natives talk.
So how do they memorize all of these words? Can they practice when they're by themselves?
The other thing that they try to do at the MTC is teach you how to make a language learning plan. But I wasn't very good at doing that part because I felt so stressed out about, I have to know everything from this last class before this next class. So I would literally I still remember having this notebook full of words, and I'd be on my morning run, just looking at the word and repeating it over and over to myself in my head.
And there's actually a book that all missionaries use to learn how to become missionaries. And this chapter 7 is all about language learning. And it's not very long, but if you want to see what missionaries, use to build their language plan, that's where you could find it.
They even have their own custom-made mission vocabulary flashcards which they can keep on them. And some of the women even say that they pin these flashcards to their skirts. I mean, at least you won't lose them that way.
So yeah, I never saw anybody using flashcards on the mission. What I actually did for a while was I brought my dictionary around with me, and when I had free time, I would read starting from A to Z. I mean, that just shows the naivete that I had of how to learn a language. I had no idea how to learn a language. I was guessing. And so that's kind of just showing you how you might learn these key skills in the MTC, but you're kind of thrown in the deep end. You don't really know how to continue studying the language.
So this way of learning is intense. There's no two ways about it. But you also learn very rapidly. And one student who did Mandarin said, I was like a deer in the headlights on the first day. But after 5 weeks, I could understand 98% of what the teachers were saying to me. I mean, it depends what the teachers were saying to you, I suppose. But it sounds great. And I personally would love to do an immersion course like this one day. So MTC, if you're watching, text me.
I would love to know if Olly is serious about this, but I struggle to see this one happening.
But it's not all rote memorization, not by a long shot. In fact, starting on day 3, the fun really begins with some role play.
They would put you from, I think it was day 3, they told us, okay, you're going to role play. You've met someone that wants to learn more about Jesus, and you're going to go meet them and talk to them in Korean, so prepare a 10-minute discussion.
What I like about this is it's very kind of circular training on very specific topics, which is a very effective way to recycle and memorize vocabulary, but also to get very confident talking about a specific topic. And this is why sometimes when people ask me about story learning, how do you recommend actually learning to speak once you've been learning with stories? My recommendation is always, well, take your stories into your lessons with you and talk about those stories you've been reading with your teacher, because it gives you a chance to recycle and use the vocabulary that you've been learning. And this seems to be what's going on here.
One thing that I really liked about the MTC was that we got to teach these fake investigators, which was just our teachers. Every day we would have a little lesson with them, they were pretending to be one of the investigators they had actually taught on their missions. And that was a really remarkable experience because we got to really see what it's like to pray and study for an investigator and really focus everything that we did on their needs.
And if you're wondering what the investigator is, well, this is what they call people who they approach, meaning someone who is investigating the Mormon faith. And this sort of ties in with another major focus here, which is praying. If your language is Korean, for example, then you will learn how to pray in Korean on day 1, and then you will pray only in Korean for the rest of the time.
I think one of the first skills that we learned actually was prayer, and praying in any language is actually involves pretty complex language, and there's a lot of sort of honorific information that you have to be familiar with and things in an Asian language. And so it was pretty advanced stuff that we were learning that in any other context would be really useless. I mean, it wasn't going to help us go to Korea and survive at all. And that's kind of okay, because the system is, when you get sent to the country or to wherever your area is, you always work in pairs, and one person in the pair will usually be someone that has been out for longer or is a native speaker of the language. And so they can handle all of this sort of, they've had enough time to figure out how to get by. And so it's okay if you don't have sort of the functional skills as much.
So prayer is actually a really interesting topic from a linguistic standpoint, because in my case, speaking Spanish, this was the only time that I was allowed to use the more informal form of tú, which is what you would use when speaking with a family member or a friend, because as missionaries, we were only allowed to use the formal form usted. And even amongst native speakers, I never heard tú being used, because in Guatemala, everyone uses vos. And so prayer was the only time that I actually had any interaction and used that conjugation form of tú. And so I might have gotten a little bit of experience using tú in prayers, but it's still pretty limited. In LDS prayers, you typically ask for things and give thanks for things, and it's not much beyond that. And so it wasn't like I was really able to get a lot of ability with the tú form. And this is actually one of my another main critique of of learning a language on a LDS mission is that you only really learn how to speak very formally. And this is something that I've struggled with for almost a decade after my mission, is that I still interact with lots of native Spanish speakers and I don't know how to communicate with them beyond the usted. I never learned to, I never learned vos because I wasn't allowed to use it. And so I don't feel comfortable communicating with people in those more familiar ways. And that really holds me back, because for a lot of people that comes off as really standoffish to be using the formal form with them. And so I would say that's one really big weakness, is that Mormon missionaries don't learn how to communicate in more casual, informal ways of speaking.
So this is where the Mormon method really diverges from mainstream learning, having a very specific context and very specific outcome where you don't have to learn vocabulary for lots of other different kinds of topics. It's very focused learning of the language needed for the mission specifically, which can include things like welfare and community service too.
So I'd like to actually introduce you to what the material looks like that missionaries use to study. So I have two books here. This one is for French, this one is for Portuguese. Unfortunately, I don't have my Spanish book anymore, but they're essentially the same. Although these have been digitized primarily for missionaries now, I wanted to just, show you that these aren't very thick books. They are pretty dense, but it's only the first 70 pages that actually focus on gospel or religious terms. The rest of the book is about everyday things. We have examples of make a telephone call, make an appointment, make a purchase, meet someone. Those are much more mainstream terms. We have medical and health, personal care. But the fact of the matter is, you don't get to those things during the MTC. The MTC only focuses on those first 70 pages. And so the rest is kind of left up to you. And at that point, you're in the country, so you kind of leave, your book to one side. You don't use it a whole lot. But occasionally it is useful to pull out and to practice, a specific example. And so they're sectioned off by topics. And so they provide prescribed dialogues for given situations. So I mentioned that they digitize these books. Well, they actually have an app called the Embark app. And the really cool thing that I like about the Embark app is that you can go from one language to another, in the sense of, I like to change my base language from English to Spanish to practice Portuguese or French. And so you can kind of double dip and do two languages at the same time. So yeah, check out the Embark app. It's pretty well done. And it's essentially what the book has, what missionaries use to learn, but in an app form. So it's pretty cool.
But I do really appreciate this as a learning method, because within the confines of what is a quite narrow topic area, you get to have higher level conversations very, very quickly. And this can help you learn the lessons of high level conversations faster. It's like if you get a glimpse of what it's like to speak at a high level, well, there are lessons there that can be learned that you can't learn if you're kind of always kind of fumbling around with different topics. It's a concept that I like to call glimpses of mastery. And I see this as a big benefit of the Mormon program.
So this idea of glimpses of mastery is really the key to the whole thing, because missionaries have one objective, and that is to teach gospel principles, so they can focus all their attention on that and become really good at that. And so I actually thought that I could apply this technique to learn French and Portuguese. And so that's why I bought these manuals, and I went through them and I used them just like I thought I had in the MTC, but it wasn't as effective. And I realized it was because I had a much wider range of needs. I wasn't focused on just one thing. For French, I was in university studies. I had totally different objectives than when I was in the MTC. And for Portuguese, it was for communicating with Brazilians and having these more informal interactions, and these cultural connections. And so the vocab and the focus that I was learning from these manuals simply was not effective. And so really that is the key to this method, is that it's so focused on this one need to get missionaries started, to get them confident, and then from there, little by little, they'll learn the rest that they need.
So it's very, very structured indeed. Check this out.
My trainer was just a language study fanatic. He would not let me get off it, and it kind of ticked me off because Like, this is what we did. So at first we started off with like lesson 1. And he's like, okay, teach the first principle of lesson 1 in 1 minute and 30 seconds to me in Tagalog. This is like day 1 of me being in the field. And I was like, oh, I can't do that. So I tried. And then by like the next day, he was like, okay, now you have 1 minute to do it. And I was like, what? And it was like 30 seconds. And he's like, okay, tell it to me in 10 seconds. Like, how would you basically describe it?
Now let's move on to where you finally arrive in your host country. Suddenly you are completely surrounded by a culture that you've only seen in movies so far. Things get real and you're going to wind up in a deeply immersive situation. There are no more safety wheels, no more pretend and role play. It's time to blend in, right? Well, kinda, but not exactly. Listen on, because this gets more interesting.
You know, when I first started, I was pretty scared. I felt really awkward going to stop someone on the street. We'll get people yelling at us, or they'll walk past us and whisper, oh, look, the Mormons.
All of us, we go 2 by 2, sometimes 3 by 3. The only times we're separated is when one was in the bathroom.
We don't watch TV, we don't watch movies. We give up our phone, we give up social media.
See, the rules are strict. There's a 9 p.m. curfew. No tea, coffee, or alcohol are permitted. No use of slang. They can't use each other's first names or nicknames. They have to wear professional clothes no matter what the weather. Yep, even in the mean summer heat and humidity of the tropics.
And this whole no use of slang from a strictness standpoint is kind of par for the course. I mean, if you were working as a bank teller or just, even as a salesman, you're going to be using polite terms and formal terms because, you're representing a company essentially. And so you really, that's just the way you're going to talk. But from a linguistic standpoint, it's quite interesting because this brings back my point that I came back from Guatemala without the ability to speak in voz and without having any concept of slang Spanish. And that's something I really wish I would have learned, but that's one of the disadvantages of being 100% in a formal setting is you really learn very little slang or just everyday colloquial speech.
Forget about time alone. That's forbidden. On a mission, you have to stick together with your partner 24/7. Now your partner is someone who is more experienced and who already knows the language. In fact, usually they speak no English at all, forcing you to only use the new language.
I remember for me, my first partner that I worked with was a Korean guy. He didn't speak much English, and I mean, he spoke way more English than I spoke Korean at the time. So, but he was sort of like, well, I'm just going to speak Korean to you. So I hope you can figure it out. And I remember we'd be at the grocery store and I'm just listening to him trying to figure out how he talks to people, and we'd be on the street catching the bus and I'm trying to figure out what the bus driver is saying. And so I sort of followed him around and mimicked him for the daily life things. And then when we would get into a missionary like proselytizing or teaching setting, he would kind of let me take the lead using what I'd learned in the training center. He'd say, okay, Derek, you're gonna take the next 10 minutes of this discussion with this person and teach them about this Bible passage or something like that. And so that was really intimidating, but I think, again, those constraints kind of allowed me to learn a little bit in a more manageable way.
And right here, what you see here is really kind of every benefit in the book as far as language learning goes. You've got a sympathetic listener, what people sometimes call a language parent.
So having a language parent is really a dream come true from a linguistic standpoint. So my first missionary companion, as we call them, was a native Guatemalan. And so he, spoke 100% with me in Spanish. My second companion was a native Nicaraguan. And then I had, several other companions that were from other countries that were native speakers. And I was just always asking them questions, always saying, did I say this right? And it really is a perfect scenario. And then, not everyone gets a native speaker for their first companion, but it'll always be someone that's got more language experience than you do.
Someone who looks after you, who you can learn from. You've got immersion, you've got a role model there, you've got like 24/7 language. And we have to add to this, no TV, no cell phones, no calling home. You can't listen to music, read books, or even watch movies that are not church approved. And you definitely cannot come within arm's length of the opposite sex.
As a missionary, we don't have any smartphones, no internet usage, we don't watch movies, like we don't even watch the news, read the newspaper. So most forms of entertainment are removed from our life.
These guys didn't mind the rules though, and you'll figure out why in a minute.
So to be nitpicky, these rules are a little bit outdated. I mean, this was the way it was back when I was a missionary in 2006, but nowadays missionaries communicate with family members quite frequently. They have cell phones, and I mean, you might say that that's kind of irrelevant, but from a linguistic standpoint, I think it is relevant because on my mission, I only spoke with my family twice a year, and I remember those phone calls and how much I struggled speaking in English, and I think that speaks to how my brain was really thinking in Spanish 100% of the time. And so to have more frequent interactions with English speakers, I do think would slow down your immersion process, would kind of be fighting your linguistic progression. And so from a language standpoint, I think the old way of not communicating back home definitely would be more helpful to help keep your mind in your target language your entire mission.
This all sounds very harsh, and I agree with you that it is. Remember though that in the stories of other highly successful language learners we've looked at, it is very much not without pain and sacrifice and a good dose of suffering too. But this level of focus with all distractions being removed, well, it just leaves you with nothing to do but get on with studying and practicing the language, doesn't it?
So yeah, the whole limiting distractions for missionaries is 100% from a teaching the gospel standpoint. It's entirely intended just to keep them focused on what their purpose is as a missionary. But it's really interesting to think about a potential linguistic benefit. I had never thought about that before, that inherently all of my, memories about back home with sports and music and all those things were just always going to be in English. And so it'd be really hard for me to think about those things and not go to my English brain. And so by keeping those distractions out, I'm sure that helped my brain think in Spanish, think more in the present and things that were in front of me at the time.
It sounds a bit like rule number 8 in my 10 rules of story learning, which is door closed, phone off. But of course, I do allow you to get out for air from time to time. And what part of this method is most interesting to you so far? Let me know in the comments and keep it respectful, please.
Speaking with everyone. As missionaries, you are told to speak to everyone. That is your job. You see someone on the street, you talk to them. Especially in Latin America, where I was, you're walking all the time. There's always people on the street, and you're just taking every opportunity to talk to somebody. So if somebody needs help moving something, you're going to use some, an icebreaker to say like, oh, can I help you move that? And that requires, a little bit more vocab. Those are opportunities that even if you were to move to another country, if you weren't a missionary, you are almost never going to just walk up to someone. And so those are opportunities to practice your language. So the key is that you're not just immersed in the language, but that you're interacting with the language 24/7.
So how do these young people stay the path? What drives them? It must get pretty exhausting and overwhelming, and I'm sure you must be wondering whether this kind of method is sustainable for the average language learner. So why do they stick with it, and what advantage do they have over people learning languages in a more traditional way? Well, these are excellent questions. So let's first take a look at the ideal conditions they've created for rapid learning.
I would say that the 3 key points are, first, the glimpses of mastery, as he mentioned, that you're focused on one thing only and you get really good at that thing. The second is that you have that language partner from the get-go that helps you gain more confidence and more experience. And then the third one being that you are always looking for people to talk to, so you have so many speaking opportunities because you're not just immersed, but you're also interacting.
There is 100% immersion. They only speak the language they're learning and pretty much banish English. Next, they have 24/7 contact with native speakers from day one throughout their training and then throughout the 2 years in the field. And if you add to this the fact that they are using language for real purpose, there's a point to it. There's an end goal they want to achieve, like desperately. Think of this as a bucket list goal. Like, it's that big of a deal to them. But this is where their number one secret really lies, I think, which is that missionaries are hugely motivated and it's personal. The rules, the challenges, it all aligns with their beliefs and their faith. So they just get on with it and they just do it. So if you're learning a language right now, what should you take? What is there for you to take from this? It's hard to say really, because there's no one single element of all this which is particularly, revolutionary or special.
So like I said, Olly did a great job in this review, but I think there is one other point that I can understand why Olly didn't want to touch on, but you really need to mention this, and that's that LDS missionaries actually believe that they are receiving divine help to learn languages. Even though to most people that seems ridiculous, that belief is just naturally going to instill confidence that you are going to learn this language. There is no like, oh, maybe I'm going to fail. You believe that you're receiving this divine help, and just imagine if you could learn a language and have that confidence.
But taken together in the round, you've got this reason why, you've got the dedication, you've got consistency, you've got practice, a fantastic environment. I think if you get these things all together, then this really does make for a kind of perfect storm of language learning conditions. And if you have all of those things together, I kind of think that really any method is going to work for you. But I'm guessing that it's not going to be easy for you to attend a 6-week immersion program and then go off to live in the country for 2 years with a partner helping you 24/7. Am I right?
So I know this was kind of a different video. First off, it was my first reaction video. Got on the fringes of some religious topics. It's a video in English. I usually don't have videos in English, but I hope that you found it interesting from a linguistic standpoint to hear maybe some things that you could adapt into your language learning. And so I hope that you liked this video. If you did, make sure to give it a like, subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one. Ciao, ciao.